So, hi everybody, I'm Emma and I'm here with Jenna, and today we're going to talk about what's your damage. Yep. So first off, just a couple pieces of housekeeping. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so just hold your questions till the end. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted to our YouTube channel tomorrow. I will send everybody who registered for the webinar a link to it via email later this week. And then please stay muted. We've got 200 people registered for this, usually about a third come. And so there's a lot of us if we're all unmuted. And then my only other request tonight is that when it comes to the Q&A at the end, we only have time for questions. And so any comments or other resources you'd like to suggest, please hold those for YouTube and put them into the comment section where everybody can see links to that. Okay. So really quickly, who are we? The name of the company that's putting this on is Backlog. We're an archival consulting firm based in St. Louis. We work with all sorts of archives, everything from small historical societies to large museums that see millions of visitors a year. We do archival needs assessments. We do policy writing. And then a big thing that we've done recently are a lot of digitization plans. Like how do we, like it's a lot of workflow writing. We also do genealogy research, so we can make sure that everything Ancestry suggested to you is correct. And we do a lot of brick wall research. So if you've been working on your Ancestry for 10 years and you have this one person you can't connect to the next generation, that's what we're really good at. And then we also do family history stuff. So family history, I always define that as anything that isn't genealogy research. So putting together digital family archives, oral history interviews, or family tree books. So I'm Emma. I worked as a university archivist for 5 years, and before that I worked in genealogy reference before I started Backlog. And whenever you reach out to Backlog, you're talking to me. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jenna.
Hey guys, I'm Jenna Duplessis. So I was a university archivist also. So like Emma, we were both loner rangers, so we had to do everything. So now I am a museum archivist, so I'm really seeing some different sides of how archives interact with other types of research and knowledge and collections. And I have seen some things. So today I want to share with you some tips and tricks for not panicking or panicking as is appropriate when you see damage to your collections, and identifying what's wrong so you can kind of assess how to triage the problem. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to go over some types of damage that you might see in your collections and their causes. I don't want to diagnose problems like in the Q&A, like with our tiny Zoom videos. I don't think that's going to be super productive. And this is all general guidance, but please keep in mind that I'm not a conservator. Conservators have a science background. I'm really lucky we actually have a conservation lab with conservators with different specialties at my museum. So a lot of things I have learned, I know when it's a problem for me to handle and when it's a problem to pass to the professionals, because I can't tell you much about like how mold grows or its chemical makeup. Next slide, please. So I want you to imagine all of the threats to archival materials. Things like environmental pollution, heat, humidity, pests, mechanical damage. There are so many things that threaten your collections and make the environment quite hostile for them to continue to exist into the future. So the damage that you'll encounter will have many degrees of severity, which will affect how you address it. And I think it's important to think differently about damage that can spread between materials versus damage that's confined to one item or group of materials. And as we go through this, I wanted to add, none of the pictures here are particularly gross. But if you need visual experience of different types of mold or bugs, or droppings, some of the resources that I mentioned or linked to will have all of that, but I didn't want to just do like a mold PowerPoint. We're approaching, most of us are approaching dinner time. So these are going to be pretty tame pictures, I think. Next slide, please. So the most obvious problem that you might see is just mechanical wear, handling wear, you can call it whatever. These things will fall apart. This is damage that comes from movement and physics and the ravages of time and gravity. These are things that can usually be ameliorated, if not mended, through supports, altering the tension of materials, and padding them out, like with textiles, so that they're not laying flat. Materials really need to be supported. So like these are two pictures I took at work when I opened a box, and I think the box, people wanted to keep different subjects separate, so they only put a couple things in the box. So the picture that's all rolled up, those are photographs, and over time the emulsion starts to shrink. And so that pulls them into this tight little roll. And it's been really hard to flatten them. But if they'd just been supported, then they would not, then the emulsion would not have shrunk in the same way. Similarly, with the papers that have gotten all curly, they didn't have enough support from the pressure of many folders filling up a box to keep them flat and straight. So the fibers start to break down with gravity and they get all curled like that. And this is just one of the easiest things that you can do. Just make sure that your materials have the support they need to not fall apart when they're touched, even when they're in storage. Next slide, please. So similar to that, the plenty of wear and tear can come from handling materials. It's funny whenever you see people on like Instagram talking about rare books, there's always a bunch of comments. Why aren't you wearing gloves? Why aren't you wearing gloves? Why aren't you wearing gloves? And leather bound books are probably the easiest thing to not wear gloves with, because the finger oils in your hands are not particularly bad for leather because it keeps it like moisturized. It is tanned skin. But gloves are useful for when you are handling photographs, things that will actually like leave fingerprints. Anything that's particularly delicate might absorb the oils on your hands. Obviously textiles, furniture. Now that I'm working in a museum, I find myself wearing gloves a lot more often because we're moving objects, not just paper. If you're just handling paper, clean, dry hands a lot of the time is sufficient because gloves can make you clumsy. I am kind of an evangelist for no nail polish in the archives. If you've ever seen like marks on like little red marks on paper from people's nail polish, if it didn't set correctly or if the paper is particularly abrasive and it just kind of swipes off a little layer of even dried nail polish, you don't want that to happen to your collections. So I have seen, some things come into the archives that are new, just like university records, and but they've gotten a little bit of damage from nail polish. So I generally think when you are working with your materials, think about what your nails look like, what your lotion situation is. If you just put on heavy lotion, maybe put some gloves on, but generally clean, dry hands for archival materials, not for photographs, not for furniture or textiles. That's the best way to handle them. And when people are doing research, don't let them lick their fingers to turn pages. You wouldn't think that you would have to tell people this when they're doing research with archival materials, but it happens. And the first time I witnessed it, I was so mortified I didn't say anything. But that is the thing people will do. So don't let them put their saliva into your collection. And not just because, like it's gross, but also like saliva actually can be used to break down organic materials. Like sometimes when archaeologists are cleaning stone, sometimes like spit will just, like if they're in the field, will actually help them break down and clean away debris if they're doing really fine work. So there are chemical reasons for this as well. Anyway, I am talking about spit too much, but as I think we'll get into, but I promise not to show you, a lot of the things that can happen to your collection are in fact gross. Next slide, please. So paper and ink are generally acidic. And in this picture, you can see that the ink in these drawings, it's probably an iron gall ink, have actually abraded the paper, it has eaten through the paper and created these holes. So that's why archival quality paper often has no lignin, which is a plant polymer. and it might be buffered in order to neutralize its pH. So at the average paper that you're using is going to have some sort of paper content. The more cotton content or rag paper, that is going to actually be more neutral in its pH. So if you remember high school chemistry, you know, if something is pH balanced, the acids and the bases prevent corrosiveness. So acidification of paper leads to changes in its appearance and to brittleness. And there are lots of adhesives that can affect your collection. So, you know, tape and most adhesives will have some sort of acidity that will affect your collections, but also the materials themselves can be acidic. If you've ever handled newspaper and seen, you know, how brittle it gets the older it gets, that's because newsprint paper is very cheap. It's made with a lot of lignin in it, and so because it's meant to, you know, be ephemeral. It's not necessarily meant to last for a long time, so it acidifies quite quickly, and that's why you'll get that yellow ghost on the paper that's next to it, or, you know, paperbacks from the 1950s will get really, really yellow because for that very same reason, because it's cheaper paper. And any high humidity or heat fluctuations will also speed up that acidification process, regardless of what the paper involved is. Another problem that you might encounter if you do have a lot of leather-bound books in your collections is red rot. So that's if you've ever touched a leather-bound book and there's sort of this like powdery red stuff in your hand, that happens with vegetable tanned leather. When the temperature and the relative humidity fluctuate too much or they get too high, the tannins kind of break down in the leather, and so you can't really stop it, but you can slow it down. And often putting that book into a buffered phase box. So buffering neutralizes the pH. There's chalk inside the cardboard. So that helps neutralize and slow down some of that acidification. And so I've also done a webinar, if you go back through Backlogs YouTube, about buying supplies. So I talk about a lot of those things in that webinar. So this is a companion to that webinar. So next slide, please. So I mentioned paper getting really yellow. This is called toning. So I just realized that, sorry, I just realized that I repeated that point. So, you know, as paper gets older, if it has really high lignin content, it is going to get this sort of brownish yellow across the whole page as it breaks down. So it's usually been exposed to too high humidity. Next slide, please. So a lot of pigments and inks are not stable. They're prone to discoloration due to light, heat, or acidification. So like this picture is from an old mimeograph. So like thermal paper, if you've ever used, well, an old photocopy or fax, or even receipts, you know, if you've ever noticed how receipts will just fade into nothing, it's that thermal paper, it's that ink reproduction process that is not particularly stable. So unless from the moment something is created, you are keeping it in a really stable environment to prevent this chemical breakdown of the inks, you're not going to be able to stop this process, which is why it's so important to not only maintain good environmental controls for your collection, but also to do preservation photocopying. So, you know, before things get too bad, make a copy with a more stable process or scan it. And so that way, as the image slowly ghosts away into nothingness on that original page, you have a copy that's more stable. And, you know, even making reproductions that, you know, like you might even have to make reproductions of the reproductions or go back, you know, there's never a permanent solution to a lot of these problems, but at least making a copy so that you don't lose that original can at least help you retain that information. Next slide, please. So you may have seen in older books, particularly books that are really good quality paper, where you're not seeing that fading toning. You're going to see these, you might see these little spots or blemishes, and that's called foxing. So that can be caused by moisture absorption, oxidization, mold stains, and not necessarily active mold. It's pretty much always brown or rust colored. So it's not the same thing as an active mold infestation, but it might be an indicator that some preventative preservation action might be necessary. So if you've ever looked at a book printed in, say, the 1700s, which I think in this picture, I think this book was probably printed in the 1700s, the paper had a really high cotton rag content. And that's why the paper here looks better than paper from like the 1950s. So this paper actually is not acidifying as quickly, but it does have some blemishes. So that is just foxing. And it's different from growing mold. And it's the sort of situation where you're gonna have to train your eye to know what it is that you're looking at. But if you've ever seen a book described as having foxing, that's what that means. Next slide, please. So we're kind of moving into the things to panic about, but problems that can spread, problems that cannot be ignored from, benign neglect. So pests would be the first one. We've got some bookworm damage in this book. I actually saw my first bit of old bookworm damage in our collection last week. I'm okay, but it was unsettling. So moths and other bugs can be they can eat a variety of things in your collection. So obviously, like bookworms, like a variety of things. Moths often love textiles. If you have entomology collections or natural history collections, like an herbarium, there are different kind of bugs that will go for those. And of course, rodents. If you have mice, then they're going to try to nibble on some of your collections as well. And some pests don't harm your materials directly, but they might indicate other problems. So I went to walk into our prep room a few weeks ago, and I opened the door and the light from behind me goes into the room, and I see a centipede go across the floor. And I do not like centipedes, so I just shut the door and went about my day and decided not to go in that room for a while because I couldn't deal with it. So centipedes aren't going to eat your collection, but they love humidity. So that kind of indicates, oh, the climate control in that room, we should probably check on that. So if you are encountering some bug problems, look not just for the bugs themselves or pests themselves, but eggs or droppings or what's called frass. If you have moths, which is just sort of like dead moth bits or the sort of organic material that comes from having moths living in your collection. And if you have insect traps, make sure that you check them regularly and on a schedule and look for changes. Next slide, please. So when you're dealing with water in your collection, beyond the problems of humidity, just full on standing water, the extent of the damage might depend on the types of materials that are affected. So like in this picture, this happened to me. The stuff that's in these boxes are LPs, like vinyl records. So I replaced all of the boxes. Fortunately, I think some of the cardboard sleeves were damaged, but it was not quite as dangerous as if these had all been boxes of paper. But the primary damage from water can easily, if you don't address it, can lead to secondary damage from mold, because as soon as you get water, mold shows up, doesn't even knock, walks right into your collection. So the water is only the first part of the problem. Next slide, please. So we could talk about mold for a full 3-day conference on different species and weird smells and different types of damage and how gross it is. And I don't know if you can see in this picture, but these are definite mold stains on a letter. I actually dealt with a basement room that had been holding records. I think it was over 100 boxes. Unfortunately, they were stored in archivally safe boxes. So the boxes all needed to be replaced, but I could salvage pretty much all of the paper and photo collections. So mold needs humidity, it needs the right temperature, and it needs something to eat. So that can be, dirt, which like any sort of soiling, which is like, if you ever notice, like you spill coffee on your bag or in your car, and like then mold starts to grow just in that one spot on a really hot summer day. It's because like the mold would like to have something to eat. Your collections are something that the mold would like to eat. Especially like the older collections, they've got lots of interesting detritus or detritus from over the years of being handled. Leather can grow mold. So mold and mildew are technically separate things. They're both types of fungi. Mold tends to be a bit fuzzier and growing outward, and mildew tends to be more flat. But basically, if you see that you have a problem in an infestation of mold or mildew, like they're going to be equally serious. Next slide, please. So if you think that you're dealing with mold or mildew, I really recommend getting a respirator. I have one crazy, like, looks like I'm in a cyberpunk situation respirator. I should have like had it to show you. If you're dealing with any sort of mold, because it's going to irritate your lungs, get eye protection if you need, well, not if you need it, but get eye protection. It's going to irritate all of your membranes. But often you can smell when you've got a problem. Mold and mildew can be a variety of colors. It's often slimy or fuzzy when it's active. So like when I moved into my apartment and had to explain to the landlord, yes, the strange mold situation did not happen a long time ago. It's actively slimy. Let's get that bleached. When mold dies off, it can reactivate. So it's not just like, oh, well, we dried it out, it's fine, it's dead. You also have to clean whatever it was that got moldy. But yeah, there are many different species of mold. There's something like 1 billion different types of fungi. So hopefully you're not like getting mushrooms growing in your collection, but there's a lot of stuff in that kingdom that is very interested in archival materials and museum collections. So use your nose, but as soon as you're like, yep, there's a mold problem, slap that respirator on. Next slide, please. So when you think you have mold or pests, any sort of problem that can spread, start quarantining things. It's also a really good idea to quarantine newly arrived materials or items that are coming back from loan or that you're receiving on loan, like to put in an exhibit from another institution. So if you just have a separate room, especially, or if it's climate controlled, or if you have a freezer, we've got a couple of chest freezers that we can put stuff in if we see problems. Just to keep the damage from spreading. But, if you've got a problem that is larger than a couple of items, I do recommend just getting professionals involved, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So next slide, please. So any sort of, disaster, whether it's a flood or, I mean, we're not really talking about fire today, but when you've got a problem and you've got to do some sort of disaster recovery, prioritize recovery of the items with the worst damage and the items that are most important to your community. So the most unique things, perhaps, maybe you have a bunch of things that seem, that are so special to your community, like say like old city directories, but that might not be as important to your community as some manuscript or photograph collections of local history. Think about what gets used the most, what is the most irreplaceable, and you might have to make some tough decisions. And it's a really good idea in your disaster plan to identify what are the things that we grab and that we try to mitigate damage to first. So act as quickly as you can, and that's why having a plan is a really good idea. But of course, people's health and safety always matter more than collections. So no one should be running into a burning building or into a flooded building. Any sort of if you have like a standing water situation, there's going to be microbes and pathogens galore. People shouldn't be like, scuba diving into your collection, storage facility that's gotten flooded to pull out some photographs. Next slide, please. So outsource major disaster recoveries when you can. There are disaster recovery companies that specialize in libraries and cultural heritage organizations. Polygon is one. If you go to the Society of American Archivists website, they have a list of vendors that can do this work. And everyone, just PPE all around. I think the pandemic really taught us the importance of masks and gloves, but also if you can get like Tyvek suits for any personnel who are dealing with materials that are moldy or have been wet, then that will keep your staff safer as well. But it's unfair to expect people who are not professionals in disaster recovery and safety to jeopardize their safety to protect collections. So it's a good idea when you have something major happen to outsource to professionals. Next slide, please. So in doing that, the services that you need will depend on the nature and the extent of the damage and the types of collections. Maybe you're just going to talk to a vendor about having a dry freezer on site so you can put collections that got a little bit wet, like say you've just got a leak but not a flood. You want to slowly dry and a freezer that will dry and freeze at the same time will keep mold from growing and also remove the moisture from the collection. So it's different from throwing something in just like the freezer that's in your kitchen. So maybe you're just renting one of those. Maybe you have really extensive damage and you do have to have professionals come and recover your collections, digitize everything because you can't save the originals. Or maybe you have a little bit of damage to only a couple of things and you just want to have a conservator try to repair that damage. So I recommend, if you just need a conservator, look at the list of conservators who are registered with the AIC, which is the American Institute of Conservators. Those are people who have that science background, as well as the art history or material culture background to actually take care of your stuff. And as I mentioned, the Society of American Archivists also has a list of disaster recovery vendors. Next slide, please. So whenever you're dealing with any type of damage, whether it's a major disaster or you're realizing that some ink is eating through some paper, someone has dealt with this before. So you're not going to be on your own. Talk to your networks, whether that's just the other museum professionals in your community, maybe you're part of a regional organization, or or go to SAA. Your listservs and forum archives, like through the SAA, will be really useful. You can search for the problem that you're having. So even if no one else is having that problem right now, you'll be able to see who has dealt with it before. Maybe you can reach out to them. You can hear about how they dealt with it. And so you might be able to connect with colleagues who have solutions or might be able to assist, especially if they're local. And, the thing that is going to, I think, keep us all intact in chaotic times is building community. So work with your community and other cultural heritage organizations or community organizations and individuals to ensure collective preservation and emergency preparation. Maybe there are resources and knowledge that you can pool. So you're not just calling, if you have some sort of disaster that's not like a town-wide disaster, you're able to call in people from other organizations to help you out, as well as your own staff. It's like the old adage of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. And being able to depend on the knowledge and skills and care of other people and institutions is going to protect our collections in the long run. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the importance of having a disaster plan. One tool that you can use is dplan, just dplan.org. It kind of walks you through not so much scenarios, but like different types of threats, whether it's fire, flood, nuclear disaster, and how likely they are to affect your collections. So you don't have to do it exactly like this, but it's a really great tool for getting you thinking about, well, how would I respond? Let me, it has you pull together the contact information for emergency services, has you think about, if you're an archive that's part of a larger organization, who at the larger organization is going to be involved with your disaster recovery. It's also important to, when you have a disaster plan, to do regular overviews, make revisions, make sure everyone, especially new staff, understands the disaster plan. So we have a historic house at my museum organization that is right on a bay. And so if there is a hurricane with a storm surge, we have to evacuate. It's a colonial property. We have to evacuate all of the stuff either to the second floor or completely out of the building. So every year, just in case, we all, in the springtime, as hurricane season starts, we review that plan, we make changes to it. We talk about things like local construction that might make it difficult to get to that house. And we talk about who has a car, who lives close by, how would we triage a problem like this? And what's the timeline for deciding what it is that we're going to do to address a problem? And preservation is always, well, usually, but I'm going to say always, easier and cheaper than conservation or recovery. So it's like the whole, I'm doing all the proverbs today, and an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or something like that. If you take steps to keep the damage from happening, you don't have to do something like fan out every single book in your collection. This picture is from, I think, a library flood like in the 80s, but I've also worked in a library where we had a ceiling, it was like an air conditioning unit leak onto a zillion books, and we had to do this with lots of fans, and it's not a good time. So preventing that thing from happening and making sure that your archival collections are in, archivally friendly housing, that is going to save you a lot of trouble in the long run. Next slide, please. So, having that stable, sturdy housing that's appropriate to your collections is really important. This top picture is the gross room. You can kind of see there's a tarp in the corner. These shelves were kind of tarped off, not to protect them from water, but because they had grown mold. So I replaced all these boxes, but the boxes prevented the worst of the possible damage from getting to these materials, whereas things that were in just regular cardboard boxes did not fare as well. Control your temperature and relative humidity. I know climate control systems are expensive, but so is having to do, disaster recovery on a mold problem. I recently read about how the humidity belt in the United States has been moving northward over the past 30 years. So the humidity belt is, I don't remember the exact parameters, but it was like the number of days that were over a certain humidity and dew point. So when it's those sticky, awful days, all the number of cities and areas that have to deal with that are getting further and further north. So if you have been having stickier summers than you ever thought possible, that when you were a kid, you didn't have summers like this, you're going to be dealing with some different problems related to like mold in your collections. So it's not just becoming a problem for places that you think of as really humid. If you have materials that are handled a lot, think about digitizing them to decrease that handling. So getting away from mold for a minute, if you have a bunch of, a class every year, say working at a university that wants to use a specific collection, that's a lot of people touching that stuff and turning pages and, refolding creases and touching edges and potentially damaging materials. So think about having either digitized copies or, really good facsimiles produced. And I know this is not possible for a lot of smaller organizations, but building a disaster recovery buffer into your budget will keep you from scrambling when you're dealing with the unforeseen problem, whether it's having to get an exterminator in, or dealing with flooding, or having to do some sort of mass digitization because your collections were severely damaged. Start building that buffer if you can, so that you can dip into that and act very quickly. Next slide, please. So some other resources that I referred to in creating this presentation, and I think you should check out. The Archives Damage Atlas is a really great one. It was produced in the Netherlands, but there is an English version, and that includes a lot of pictures. So you can be like, oh, that's what that problem is. The Midwest Art Conservation Center resources, and the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts are two really great ones. I actually live in New England, so I'm not in St. Louis. So we work a lot with the Northeast Document Conservation Center, or the NADCC. They do conservation and digitization, but they also provide a lot of free resources. So they have these preservation leaflets, which I think used to actually be, like a brochure, but now it's all online. And they also do online courses, kind of like this, but for very specialized problems. And the National Archives Holdings Maintenance Guidance for Paper-Based Records. If you want to know, what's the National Archives doing, then you can kind of look at their guidance as well, just on the National Archives website. So that is, I think that's my last slide, right? I go into a fugue state and I just start talking. So that is everything that I had to say. I will pass it back to you, Emma, and I welcome your questions.
So really quickly, our next archives webinar is on open source software, and that's in September. And then we're also doing one on archival arrangement and description in October. If you go to our website and then if you click upcoming webinars, you'll find all the information on these and links to register. And again, all of our webinars are free. You just have to register in advance. And we record all of our webinars and put them on our YouTube channel if you want to check that out. The webinar that Jenna mentioned about ordering supplies is also on here. I think we did it last fall, but it's really popular. So if you go into videos and hit popular, it's one of the top ones. So, okay. So we don't have a chat tonight. So if you're interested in asking us a question or asking Jenna a question, you can go ahead and just unmute and I guess fire away. Or you can use the raise hand function, whatever works. And we do ask that if you want to share resources or stories, that you wait for the YouTube comment section.
Hi, my name is Molly Shannon. I'm with the Desert Southwest Conference of the United Methodist Church. As the name implies, we are in fact in a desert. So you talked a lot about humidity, but that is not really a problem that I anticipate having. So are there ways in which a lack of humidity could provide a damage to my collections? And also separately, if you know of any good resources for describing types of paper, particularly those thermal papers that we encounter, that would be really great. I think I found one, but I don't see it as much for paper as photos, but it's still useful if you know of one. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the recommendation is between 30 and 50% humidity is ideal. If things are too dry, if the situation is too dry, like the environment, then materials can get quite brittle. I don't know if you ever see, under 30% humidity in your collection storage. And yeah, that's the opposite of a problem that I would usually have to think about. So that's, I guess you could get a humidifier if that were a problem, but most of the materials we're dealing with can tolerate, down to a 30% relative humidity. So, it's not, how I put this, it is probably a less frequent problem, but that doesn't mean that it's not a problem. And, I haven't actually seen a good resource for describing different types of paper. This is mostly just stuff I've picked up. and being like, what is this? Photocopies with the purple ink, what is this? Or getting into like the Wikipedia category of like photo reproductive processes. Sometimes that has helped. So I don't have any recommendations there. I don't know if anybody else will, you know, when we get to the YouTube comments. There might be books on like conserving paper. I feel like we used to have one like in our reference library. Now I can't think of the actual title of it. So I don't have anything there. I'm sorry.
It's all right. Thank you.
Yeah, we're dealing with a lot of humidity. So like desert climates were not on the radar this week. Sorry, Molly, but really good question.
No worries. It's kind of a unique problem.
What state are you guys located in?
I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, but we have churches up into southern Nevada and a tiny bit in California.
Okay, cool. So literally the desert, yeah.
Yep, it's in the name. Thank you.
So if anybody has a question, go ahead and unmute.
Hi, I'm Lori Podolsky, and I'm with Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. Humidity is in our name. I have a question regarding using common store supplies and that. I've heard different things about like magic erasers being used on documents, and that's fine to clean things up, stuff like that. Is there anything that you would recommend we can sometimes use, because it's not always feasible, or we can't always afford to get some of the stuff from the archival supplies companies, but that we can maybe get at the local grocery store or something, and anything to absolutely avoid?
Yeah, so I was recently working on some papers, and I actually talked to our conservators to get some help. There are sponges that are designed for removing soot that I think you can get at like a hardware store. Kind of cutting those into little bits, and I mean, you've got to be incredibly gentle, and you know, moving from the center outward, and you know, and testing to make sure that's not going to rub at the ink. But that can help remove soil from paper. And also the Mars plastic erasers, which you can get at like art stores. Those like Stettler is one of it's a German company. That's one of the brands. It's why one of our conservators is German, and so she was teaching us how to say it. That was also something that I used. And sometimes you can actually crumble those into really like little pellets and kind of like smooth them over a surface to remove soiling. And I wouldn't do that for like if something is like active fuzzy mold, but if you have like dried mold or just dust, you know, something's been sitting out and you're pulling it, you know, you're bringing it into the archives and it's been sitting in a house for 80 years. Those are yeah, I think I'm trying to think, and yeah, I think I used some brushes that were basically just really soft paint brushes to deal with dust and things. But I haven't used a magic eraser, and I'm not actually sure how that's different from the soot thing. And that's one of those like chemical things that I'm not quite sure. I'm just like, conservators, tell me your knowledge. But those are things that have worked for me. But obviously, gentleness is very important.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was a really good question. Yeah, anybody else? All right. Well, we can end it here for this evening. Again, I will email everybody out a link, and if I remember, I will put some of the links to things that Jenna suggested, like the NEDC stuff. I just thought that all of the things that we went through are Googleable, and it's really hard to copy down a URL when we're going through a presentation. But thank you everybody for attending. And then we hope to see you on one of our other webinars this fall on different types of open source softwares. And then on archival arrangement and description. And that's all about kind of planning and executing projects. So it's another kind of high level project management one. So we did one earlier this year in digitization that Jenna gave, and it was again, kind of how do we project manage these archives workflows. But thank you, everybody. And we'll hope
Thanks.
to see you again soon.
Thank you. Have a good weekend or have a good week.
You too.
Thanks.